Welcome. I'm Rick Carney, coordinator for the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative. For those of you who may be new to the LCC, we are a partnership among public and private groups working together to meet large-scale conservation challenges across the 5 states of the Great Basin region. We have supported a variety of conservation projects on high-priority topics. This series highlights a few of these projects, plus more. We hope that these webinars can provide a platform for discussion about the research and its application here in the Great Basin. We will keep today's presentation relatively short, about 30 minutes, and reserve the second half of the hour for questions and discussion with the presenter. Since there are many folks participating in the webinar today, we ask that you type in your questions as they arise. We'll show you how to do that in just a minute. And then we'll read your questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation will be recorded and available on our website in just a few days. On your screen, you'll notice there's a small collapsed control panel in the upper right-hand corner. By clicking on the small arrow button, you can expand this control panel. In this expanded panel, you can type in your questions at the very bottom in the chat box and press send. This question will be sent to us to respond to at the end of the webinar. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tamara Wall. Dr. Tamara Wall is an associate research professor of atmospheric science with the Desert Research Institute based here in Reno, Nevada. She is the deputy director of the Western Regional Climate Center and a researcher in a program for climate, ecosystem, and fire applications, as well as the California-Nevada Applications Program. She is involved in several ongoing and planned projects relating to integrating social science research with the production of climate knowledge and services. And so, without further ado, I'd like to turn over control of the presentation to Dr. Tamara Wall.
All right, thank you, Rick. Well, thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm excited to talk about this project, which has been ongoing for several years and is wrapping up right now. So I'll just talk a little bit about the project itself and the methodology and kind of how it came to be, and then move on into how the project unfolded and how we're wrapping up. So this project several years ago, the Great Basin LCC had requested some proposals that looked at how traditional ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge could be used to actually help inform natural resource management. And so at that time, I had been working a little bit with the Bishoot Paiute tribe, particularly the Food Sovereignty Program. And so I started talking to Brianna Vaughn at the Bishoot Paiute tribe as well about some of their needs in the Food Sovereignty Program. And two of the things that kind of came out of these conversations were the challenges in using traditional knowledge in Western natural resource management practices. To me, they kind of fall into 2 camps. The first one is that this is extremely and oftentimes very culturally sensitive information. There are proprietary issues, there's confidentiality issues, and there are ownership issues that all need to be respected and managed when this type of information is sought, or as people are seeking this type of information, particularly when it's a federal agency, because of Freedom of Information Act potential requirements. The other challenge is the translation part of it, which is traditional knowledge often works on different timescales with different descriptors, and there's often very differences in what is salience across what I think of a divide in perspective between tribal communities and their knowledge base and natural resource management professionals and the knowledge that they come from. So trying to find a way to both respect the cultural sensitivity of this information while also trying to understand how it could be translated into Western cultural management practices is often a really big challenge. And like I said, talking with Brianna Vaughn with the tribal sovereignty program with the Bishoot Paiute tribe. This is a really wonderful program that is doing a lot of great work. They have, you'll see here a picture, these pictures were provided by the Food Sovereignty Program, that they have a very large and substantial garden where they're growing a number of different crops next to the Bishoot Paiute Tribe Cultural Center. And really they're trying to use traditional foods to promote healthy eating habits, and also the concept of sovereignty through those foods as well. So in talking to the federal managers, some of their interests in what this methodology had to combine were kind of two different sets of interests. The federal natural resource managers, they were really interested in tribal perspectives on what were the biggest risks to areas in the Great Basin that were important to these tribal communities, and also what plants and animals were important. For the Food Sovereignty Program, they were interested in gathering this culturally sensitive information. There was a real concern that some of the stories may be lost in the next few years. They were concerned about passing knowledge between generations. In particular, they were also very interested into barriers to healthy eating. What were the problem, why, if people weren't engaging in healthy eating habits, what were the barriers to that? They're also very concerned about passing on traditional knowledge, and they were really curious about how people felt that knowledge should be communicated. And they also wanted to know about any concerns that the community had related to traditional foods. So the methodology that I chose to do this project is a fairly novel methodology. It combines several different aspects of both qualitative and quantitative data. It's called Sensemaker, and it was developed by a company called Cognitive Edge, and is based on complexity theory developed by David Snowden, who is the founder of Cognitive Edge. Essentially, it provides a prompt and then asks participants to give a short story in response, and then answer a series of very carefully constructed questions. And how those questions are constructed is very unique, and it is not a survey. And I'll go through that in a little bit. And it can be collected in a variety of ways. Data can be collected online through a collector. It can be collected on devices through an app, such as iPads or phones. It can be done through what's called naïve interviews, where you have people who go out and actually interview people and then input the data into a device such as an iPad or a phone. It can be collected through story circles, where people sit in a circle and in response to prompts share stories around the circle, and then perhaps either input it into an iPad or a phone, or with hard copies as a pen and paper. Unlike qualitative interviews, there can be an unlimited number of data points. I've often heard of Sensemaker data sets that numbered in the thousands, if not more than 10,000. But unlike surveys, the narratives provide insight into the quantitative data in a way that you just do not get with surveys alone, even if you do have open-ended questions in there. The other key is because you have that narrative story, and then people essentially provide context to that story by answering the questions. So it is very unlike a survey in that aspect. And it's often very interesting to compare responses across the different questions. The analysis can be very simple, to simply a visual analysis or simple percentages, to very complex, depending on the number of data points. Generally, the ideal is to have a minimum of 200 to 250 stories. One person can provide more than one story, but for a really robust analysis, that is generally considered the minimum. Although you can do some statistical analysis with less than that, depending on how you bin certain items. And then one of the most important parts of this is that Sensemaker allows for strong confidentiality. Because the stories, the cultural sensitivity of the stories that we were going to ask from people, the narratives can be kept confidential, while how the questions are answered actually becomes the data that can be used to guide programs. And so that was a really important component for me in selecting this methodology, is that it allowed the narratives to be kept completely confidential. So just give you an idea of what a story prompt looks like. So these are the two story prompts that we used for this project. And generally you try to have both a positive and a negative, and or a neutral story prompt that people can respond to. And then once people have picked a story prompt, in this case, we allowed them to either record a response or a story. We also offered the opportunity to have their picture taken if they wanted to have their picture taken. And then the questions that you answer in this methodology, the Sensemaker methodology, are called Triads and Dyads. And so here, essentially what we're trying to do is contextualize the narratives, and it allows us to look for patterns across the data set. These are two examples from the question framework that we developed for this project. The Bishop-Paiute tribe food sovereignty staff was integral to developing this framework. We worked very hard on this and developed it over a number of months. Again, talking to them about what their concerns were, and then thinking about how those could go into questions and what the endpoints of these triangles should be. So what people do is they move the ball, if you can see that in the center of the triangle, either with their finger or a cursor, depending on if they are on a device with a touch screen or sitting at a computer. And they move that ball to the corner that is closest to what is most meaningful to the story that they just provided. So if if it was they kind of felt like their story was halfway between friends, neighbor, and family member, they would move the ball to kind of like halfway along the side there. If all three were equally important, they would leave it in the center. If they really felt that family members were the most appropriate way to learn about traditional knowledge, then they would move the ball all the way into the corner of family member. And if they felt it wasn't appropriate to their story or pertinent, then they would just click on not applicable. Once we had the framework developed, I had hired several community research assistants to work on the project located in Bishop that were co-located with the food sovereignty program. We did some cognitive interviewing where I went out with them into the community and observed while they interviewed people, and we found some glitches in the framework and things that weren't really relevant for people. And so we made some tweaks and then we were ready to go. This is an example of another type of question that's in the methodology, and these are called dyads. And the key with these is that, again, you slide the ball along towards the endpoint that is most meaningful to your story. Is that they're always positive, positive, or negative, negative. We don't ever design a dyad that's positive, negative, because that puts it along a continuum, and that's not what we're looking for in these. People generally know what the right answer is, and people also generally tend to want to make other people happy or have a trait called satisfying. And so we don't want to give away that there is a right answer, because really there is no right answer. We're not interested in if always the positive answer or always the negative answer. So we ensure that these endpoints are always have the same polarity, or similar in tone. And then the last type of questions that we used in this study are what we call sticky questions, and they're basically about demographic data. So they might contain, kind of categories for age. In this project, we had what traditional foods were important. to the storyteller, what tribe they were with. So often these are very specific to the project, but then we also have some kind of common ones like what was the overall outcome of the story in terms of was it positive or negative. And then just to give you an example of what this looks like after a project has been completed and all the data is collected. This is from a project that's wrapping up right now, Barriers to Climate Change Adaptation in the Southwest. And in this study, we were interested in what the barriers were to climate change adaptation. And this was a triad that asked about kind of the role of leadership or line officers, in that story. And the legend is about if they were planning to do an on-the-ground climate adaptation action within the next 2 years. If they said yes, as they had already done a climate adaptation action on the ground, and no, as they were not planning nor had they done one. And so you can see what gets interesting just visually in this methodology is how you can look at the data based on the demographics and start to pull trends out. And you can see in this one that the no's, the people who had not engaged in any climate change adaptation, or nor were they planning to do so, are kind of spread out all across the circle. And so leadership, if they're not planning or haven't done one, there's no obvious trends, but if they had done a climate change adaptation action or they were planning to, then leadership that listened and supported, or was somewhere in between on those became a lot more relevant for people. And then here is an example of a dyad that pulled from another project that's wrapping up as well on fire stories, particularly looking at firefighters' perception, wildland firefighters' perceptions of extreme wildfire behavior. And this dyad is kind of a classic bell curve, which is you get from how where people put the ball on the bar of the dyad. And kind of what you expect to get is a bell curve like this. When you don't get a bell curve, then that means that there's something really interesting going on. What this one was divided out was performance. One of the tensions for wildland firefighters is kind of assessing risk and taking on some level of risk, but not too much risk. So there's kind of a balancing act between efficacy and risk. And when we sorted these stories by the overall outcome of the story, which there were remarkably few in this data set, which is one of the interesting things that came out, you see that the stories with the negative outcomes tended to lean more heavily towards taking on way too much risk. So those are just some examples of what the output looks like from this methodology. So in this project, we had several things that we needed to address in terms of the cultural sensitivity of this potential information. And so the way that we did that, working with the Food Sovereignty Program staff, is we decided that they could record, or the interviewer could type in the story to a device. As I mentioned earlier, they would have a photo option. There is also an option to check a box if they wanted a copy of the recording and the transcript mailed back to them. Also, if they wanted to have the story archived at the Bishop Paiute Tribe Cultural Center. And then we also agreed that all narratives and data, a copy of all that data would be given to the Bishop Paiute Tribe, and then I would delete it at the end of the project once the report was completed. That fulfilled, all of the institutional review board requirements and more, but it was basically an agreement between the Food Sovereignty Program and myself on how we would ensure the confidentiality of this data. So data collection approaches, we tried an awful lot of things. One thing that I have learned with this methodology is that you never know in a project what is going to work, and sometimes you really have to roll with the punches, so to speak, and just keep trying things. until you find something that is a hit, and you actually start getting some data coming in. So we started with outreach to all enrolled tribal members. We sent a postcard to every enrolled tribal member, telling them about the project and letting them know that people may be coming around, the research assistants may be coming around to ask them to share their stories. I hired first one community research assistant, and then after about 6 months, hired a second research assistant who are also working with the Food Sovereignty Program to help coordinate with NASA, the Native American Student Association that is active at the Bishop High School. And the original intent of the project was to work specifically with the NASA students or other high school students to engage them and use them in the interviewing process to actually gather the data. This was important to the Food Sovereignty Program, getting back to how is information passed between different generations. And we thought it might be a way to actually engage a younger generation, in these stories and in traditional knowledge and ways of hunting and gathering. So our original intent was to have them involved throughout the research process. So we would actually ask them and train them on how to gather data, and then actually do an analysis workshop with the students as well, with the idea that they could potentially use that to leverage college applications for those applying to college. We decided that as a thank you, we would offer up coffee cards to a local coffee shop to the NASA students. For every story they gathered, they would get a small value coffee card in an effort to support local business as well. So I drove down to Bishop one day and we did a lunchtime introduction of the project. And then we did a follow-up kind of little mini seminar on how to do the data gathering over lunchtime and going through the research protocol, which we had about 12 students there. The research assistants, the community research assistants I hired were also to do directed interviews in the community. So it was kind of finding people to interview and going out and interviewing them. And then we also tagged on to a First Bloom trip. First Bloom is a fantastic program the Food Sovereignty Program hosts, which focuses mainly on middle school children. And they take them out and do all sorts of things in both the garden and trips into Yosemite. So they had one overnight trip going into Yosemite, and how we decided to gather most of the data on this was using iPads. And so they took the iPads into Yosemite with them. And what I heard back was that the kids loved interviewing their parents and grandparents. And I think in many ways, it was probably one of the most successful ways that we gathered data. I gave a presentation on this project about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago. And we were doing one last push for data collection, but we ended data collection last year right about this time. I followed up with discussions with the Food Sovereignty Program on kind of what worked and what didn't work. And I'll have a final report and evaluation of the method out in January of 2018. In the end, I am saddened to report that data collection failed. We collected less than 10 stories. Most of those came from the First Bloom trip or the community research assistants. I think we had maybe one or two stories collected by one of the NASA teams. And so part of the discussions with the Food Sovereignty Program is kind of why things worked or didn't work. And I think there's several reasons and also some lessons learned from this about moving forward. The first was that there was a really small potential study population. There's less than 500 people registered, enrolled in the Great Basin, the Bishop Paiute tribe, and many of those actually do not live in Bishop. And so it was a challenge to, find people who were willing to be interviewed for the project. But I do believe that it could be successful if it was aggregated across the Great Basin in other regions. So even a small tribal population could still be included in this type of study, but it would have to have the funding to support working across other tribal communities as well. The NASA students were simply not motivated. I think they're teenagers and they just weren't. And maybe we just didn't find the right students, but we didn't have those key 3 or 4 students that really wanted to go out and gather stories. Also with the community research assistants, I think life happens, and life certainly happened to my community research assistants in a pretty big way. And they also became very distracted from working on the project due to no fault of their own. I think one of the other problems was the distance. I was from Bishop and I wasn't able to check in on the project as frequently as I would have liked. And those all contributed to the low rate of data collection. So I had several kind of end of project questions about this time last year, right when we were trying to do one last push for data collection. And I have to say that I think the answer for 1 and 2 on this list is unfortunately no. We did not meet the original objectives of the project in providing information that can support management decisions in the Great Basin. Unfortunately, I also don't think we gathered enough data. We have some, but we did not gather enough data to truly help the Bishop Paiute tribe food sovereignty program with program development, which was the other goal of the project. But for, oops, I see that's number 5, it should be number 3. I got my list is all out of order. The last one on that list is, however, I think a strong yes. I think that the questionnaire framework we developed is solid and it has now been tested and it could be used with very small tweaks in any tribal community in the United States. I think it would work better in areas with a larger number of potential participants or in an aggregate geographic sense. I am still very keen on working with students. I think working with students has a lot of potential possibility for a whole host of reasons. But I am wondering now if perhaps younger than high school or as maybe having it as part of a specific class project would be a better approach. When I think back to the descriptions of how excited the First Bloom students were to interview their parents and kind of be in control of that situation, I think maybe middle school is the way to go if it's possible. I'm still a strong believer in the value of community research assistants to coordinate and to contribute back to the community. I think they're really key for projects like this. And the fact that it didn't work out in this case is just really a reflection of life happens. And sometimes things just don't line up the way we want, no matter how hard we try. I also think that a concentrated data collection period might be more effective with a researcher actually working in the community or coming into the community frequently during the collection period. There are some really great examples of using this methodology in refugee camps in Turkey, for example. There was I'm not sure who the funder was, but they hired approximately, I think about 20 or 30, maybe about 20 college students, trained them in the protocol, specifically on going into very large refugee camps in Turkey. And in the space of about 2 weeks, they gathered something like 8,000 stories. So it can be a really, a concentrated data collection period with a large number of people can be a good way to get a lot of data with this methodology. One of the other challenges with this methodology is if you're working in what I call an open system, like we were, as a community, but the community was somewhat dispersed and people were a little hard to find and there's a relatively small number. In other ways where I've used this methodology, again, it's, it's kind of an open system. We were asking natural resource managers across the Southwest. It's harder to gather data in a system like that than it is a closed system like a refugee camp where you have a large number of potential participants, you know, in a relatively small geographic area, and then you can kind of flood it with, you know, people gathering data and gather a large number of stories in a relatively small period of time. So I just want to say thanks to the Bichoot Paiute Tribe Food Sovereignty Program. We would not have a well tested framework for potentially other communities to use if it was not for their support and help. The NASA students and especially their teachers for being willing to support this project and allowing me to come in and use their lunch hours to talk to them about it and find out who was interested. The community researchers, James Napoles and Shanae Vega, who both did their best, but as life happens. So in the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative and also the NOAA RISA program, the California Nevada Applications Program, it also contributed some funding to this project as well. And that is the end of my presentation, and I would love any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Tam. I think it's a great example of sometimes things don't go as planned, and yet there are still some lessons to be learned from the event. I'd like to turn it over now to Ms. Emma Segar up at Enviro Issues, who can perhaps read some of the questions that we received during the presentation.
Thanks, Rick. We have one question in right now, and so I'd encourage others while Tamara's answering this one, please consider typing in any questions you might have via the control panel. But the first question, Tamara, was, can you tell us a little bit more about the Senseware software? So how much of this design was already built into the program? How much of it did you develop? Is it easy to work with? How much does the program cost, et cetera, things like that?
Okay. So the Sensemaker methodology and software is a little bit of a heavy lift. The online collector and the apps are all there, you know, and once you pay for access, then you have access to those. But you do pay a monthly fee when you have a project that's active. They program it in, and you get a code that you can then enter into the app or to an online collector, and you pay for that server time. So every month that the project is active, you pay a cost. I'm trying to remember, I think it's $400 to $500 a month for the server time. And you also pay a certain amount of money. I want to say it's maybe $1,200 to have it coded so that it's ready to go on the servers. And then doing this methodology in itself is a little bit of a heavy lift. There is quite a bit of theory behind these question frameworks are developed. And that can be a little challenging to get your head around. You know, I always joke the first time that I did one of these, which was for the Fire Stories project, I thought my head was going to explode. And it was really hard to kind of get myself into how this actually worked. You know, and having done, I think, 3 or 4 of these now, it does get easier, but there's a lot to it. And there's also other types of questions as well that I did not include in this project that are also challenging to kind of figure out how you actually, what you want to ask and how you want to ask it. So there's a little bit of, there's some upfront cost. It is proprietary. So you kind of have, you know, legally you have to do it on the Cognitive Edge servers. I work through some second party vendors as well that are, that it is legal to work through, and they work closely with Cognitive Edge, and they're very helpful as well.
Great, thank you. We do have a few more that have come in. The next question was, how many of the respondents wanted a copy of the data or wanted it to be archived?
I think I would have to go back and double check, but only a few. I want to say it was only maybe 3 to 4, but I would have to double check that. And if you email me after this, I can tell you for sure.
Sounds great. And just so everyone knows, when you submit a question, we'll get a report of all these and can provide it to Dr. Wall after the presentation as well. So you'll be able to see who asked what question and their contact information.
Okay.
The next question great. The next question was the methodology developed specifically for Native American communities?
No, actually, interestingly, the original methodology was actually funded by DARPA, and it was designed as counterterrorism, as a way to examine counterterrorism networks and try and figure and kind of see patterns across those networks in communication. And so the original intent was very different. Now how it is it's used very widely actually in Australia, New Zealand, and more so in Europe, particularly England. It's not used that widely here in the United States yet. But it's Boeing has a very strong Sensemaker program, particularly looking at safety and performance issues. So if employees are where they feel that there might potentially be safety issues or areas where they feel like performance can be improved. So they have a fairly strong program that utilizes Sensemaker as one component of that. It's been used in hospitals very successfully to look at patient close calls. And it's also been used pretty strongly by Oxfam and other NGOs, looking at giving trends as well as other, I think another one was actually looking at access to dental care in Australia and what were the barriers to dental care.
Really interesting. Okay, our next question was how many people can access the app per purchase? And that same person asked if you can be contracted to develop questions for specific tribes.
As many people, there is no limit. So, like I said, some data sets have, I think the largest one that I've ever heard of anybody working with had 11,000 data points in it. And so when you get into something that large, you end up not doing visual analysis so much, but go into some kind of heavy duty statistical analytics. But the sky's the limit, which is one of the really great things about this methodology, is that it can handle, anywhere from 250, on up. And I would be happy, this framework is available. It was publicly funded, through the Great Basin LCC and CNAP, and I would be happy to work with any tribe to tweak it for their use. I would particularly really like to see it used. I think that would be a great thing, and I'd be happy to help that happen. There will be some, analysis costs, after the fact. But like I said, I know some good secondary vendors that are really great to work with.
Wonderful. And just to reiterate, you'll be able to see who asked that question and their contact info after the presentation. So the last question we had in was just about whether this presentation will be available as a recording afterwards, and it will be. We'll be putting it on our website by the end of the week, and you'll get an email with the link to that recording when it's available. At this time, we don't have any other questions that have been typed in, but if folks do still have things they'd like to discuss, please do that. And Rick, if you have any questions, or Tamara, if there's anything else you wanted to say, please feel free.
This is Rick, and I was thinking as we were going through the questions that people typed in about the potential application in determining valuation of ecological services as a potential use for this approach. Oftentimes, it's very hard to quantify the level of support that certain groups, even members of the public at large, have for the benefits of quality ecological conditions. Are you familiar with any other applications that might be useful, Tam? Both in valuation of ecological services and perhaps other uses of this approach.
Well, it's funny that you use the word evaluation, Rick, because earlier this morning I was talking with my colleague Lori Webster, who is a very, very experienced Sensemaker practitioner, and we've been talking more about how we can use this in evaluating different different aspects, either evaluating a program, and I think that is an idea that has a lot of potential, and I hadn't thought of using it in terms of looking at kind of that sticky question of, how do people actually, value a natural resource? Because I think one of the problems with that is when you try and do it from an economic perspective, you miss out on those place-based important things to people. Why that place is important to them. It may be because they remember going there and camping with their grandfather or with their parents, and it's really hard to quantify that kind of value, but it's also really important for, continuity of culture and traditions. And a survey just simply does not capture that. And at the same time, if we try and do it through in-depth interviews, which do have that richness and that thickness, and we can actually get that, the sample is often so small that it's really hard to make it relevant to a larger geographic area. So yeah, I think this method could potentially kind of bridge that gap and, again, both provide that kind of narrative contextualization where the story actually helps us understand the quantitative data, but the quantitative data is robust enough to actually say these are the patterns that we see across this study area, and they're actually really meaningful. The first project I used this methodology on was trying to understand firefighters' perceptions of extreme fire behavior, which is really tricky because, the question or the response I got over and over again was, well, how do you know it was extreme? And I was always like, well, if they think it's extreme, then that's what I want to know. Like, I'm not trying to quantify, was that really extreme fire behavior or not? I mean, that was kind of later for the analysis part, but I just wanted to know, if they thought it was extreme, I wanted to know the story. And what we were really trying to find out were those events that happen in wildland firefighting that, something almost happened, but not quite. Because the concern is that if firefighters were being surprised by extreme fire behavior, then that was often a dangerous situation for their health and safety. And so we really wanted to pull that out. And my argument for using this methodology was that a survey was never going to capture this kind of information. And at the same time, if I did a case study approach, I could say a lot about one particular fire or one particular event that everybody agreed on was extreme fire behavior, but it was perhaps only relevant for that event. Extrapolating that and saying this is relevant, in other geographies and other situations, felt like too big of a stretch. And so we used the Sensemaker methodology to gather those stories and found some really interesting trends in terms of both gender and situational awareness in terms of weather knowledge, and also in outcomes. That one example dyad that I showed, I mentioned that the stories that where the storyteller perceived a more negative outcome, those had really distinct patterns across the data set. And so it allows us to say a little bit more like these are bigger patterns that we think are running through wildland firefighters' experiences rather than just about one particular event. So I do think there's good possibilities in using this to value ecological services. The question is who would pay for it, Rick?
Let's talk offline. Emma, other questions?
We have not received any other questions yet, Rick, so we can wait a couple more minutes and see if anyone that sparked any more ideas or thoughts in people's heads, and please feel free to type those in.
Well, as we wait, I just wanted to thank you once again, Tamara, for presenting today. I've found that to be a very interesting presentation, and I know others did too. This, in fact, is the last of our webinars for 2017, and I think it was a terrific example for all of us to see just how we can begin to integrate social sciences into the decision-making process, even if this particular exercise didn't work out. It certainly highlights some of the challenges we have integrating social science, but it was a very valiant effort, and we thank you.
Well, thank you, Rick. And I think that is why I would be so interested in another tribal community using this question framework, is that, you know, that is the big piece of it that I didn't get to tackle, which is how do you then take this information and translate it into a way that supports natural resource management decisions and also honors that information. And I didn't get to do that, and it really bums me out. So I would really like to help somebody else take this framework and use it in their community and see where they can take it into the next step.
And Tamara, we did get one more question. It is, I understand that the data will be erased, but would any participants be willing to share their stories?
You know, I'd have to check and see who, you know, whatever ones were selected for archiving, you know, they'll be at the Bishu Paiute Tribe Cultural Center. And so I think that would probably be the best place to start, because if they've indicated that they're at the cultural center, then I think they've indicated that they're willing for those stories to be shared.
Great, thank you. Well, that was the last question I saw typed in. So I might put our concluding slide up on the screen.
Well, there you have it.
Rick, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Tamara, thank you once again for an outstanding presentation here today. And for those who are listening in, you're very welcome. For those who are listening in, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar. As you know, a recording of this presentation will be available on our website later this week. And if you have any questions about the LCC or this research, please feel free to contact myself or Dr. Wall. Our contact information is showing on the screen here. Now, last but not least, we really want to know what you thought of today's presentation. Please take our short 2-minute survey that will appear on your screen as you log off here today. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us to plan and improve upon future webinars. This is the last webinar in our 2017 series. And we invite you to look into 2018. We are starting to assemble presentations to give next year. And if you have particular ones that you would love to hear about, please send those in to myself and or to Dr. John Tull, our science coordinator. His contact information is also here on the screen. Thank you very, very much for being with us today. And I wish for you a very wonderful holiday season and look forward to speaking with you again soon. Take care now. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.